Look at her. A little girl pilot. She won't last 5 minutes. Laughter erupted throughout the base as young soldiers slapped each other's backs in mockery. The small woman kept her head down, offering no response, simply tightening her flight gloves. Hours later, 300 Marines were trapped in a sea of fire. When everyone thought it was over, Apache rotors tore through the sky. Radio crackled with a female voice. "Hold your ground. I'm here." The entire battlefield held its breath. Reina Vasquez was 28 years old, with long brown hair, a thin frame, and determined eyes that rarely looked directly at others. At the base, she was known by a mocking nickname, the Little Girl Pilot. Her fellow soldiers treated her like a joke. She's too small to control an Apache. A strong wind would blow her right out of the pilot's seat. Real combat would eat her alive. In the mess hall, groups of young soldiers would tease, "Look at her. She won't last 5 minutes in combat." Reina remained silent, cleaning her flight helmet without reaction. At night, she would sit for hours in the cockpit of her silver Apache, checking every technical detail with meticulous precision. She believed in the aircraft when the entire world laughed at her. A maintenance worker later recalled, "She would whisper to that Apache, 'If they don't believe in us, we'll prove them wrong.'" Her voice was quiet, but rock solid. I knew she was living for something bigger than herself. What her tormentors didn't understand was that Reina's quiet confidence came from knowledge they couldn't imagine. She had survived training that broke most candidates. She had mastered systems that took years to learn. She understood helicopter combat at a level that exceeded most of her critics' comprehension of basic flight operations. But her small stature and reserved personality made her an easy target for soldiers who confused physical size with capability. They saw someone who looked vulnerable and assumed she was. They observed her preference for working alone and interpreted it as antisocial behavior rather than professional focus. Most importantly, they had never seen her under combat conditions. In training exercises, she performed competently, but didn't seek to demonstrate superiority. She completed missions without fanfare and avoided the kind of aggressive displays that impressed her peers. This restraint was interpreted as evidence of limited ability rather than mature professionalism. The Apache she flew was a massive, complex weapons system that required both physical strength and mental precision to operate effectively. Her critics assumed that someone of her size couldn't handle the demands of combat flying. They were unaware that helicopter combat relied more on mental processing, spatial awareness, and tactical understanding than on raw physical power. While they focused on her appearance, Reina focused on perfecting skills that could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. She knew that combat had a way of revealing truth that peacetime evaluations couldn't capture. When lives were at stake and conventional expectations failed, competence mattered more than appearances. She also knew that underestimation could be an advantage. Enemies who dismissed her as ineffective would make tactical errors that she could exploit. The day when her true capabilities would be tested was approaching faster than anyone expected. When that moment came, the little girl pilot would prove that heroism came in unexpected packages. The operation exploded into chaos from the first moment. 300 Marines found themselves trapped at a forward airbase, surrounded by enemy forces that outnumbered them 20-1. The defensive perimeter was collapsing. Ammunition was running critically low. Medical supplies were exhausted. Radio transmissions filled with desperation. "We can't hold them. We need air support." In the command center, officers watched tactical displays with growing hopelessness. All available aircraft were engaged in other operations or too far away to provide immediate assistance. A staff officer exhaled heavily. They won't survive the night. The Marines on the ground were preparing for their final stand. Some wrote letters they hoped might reach their families. Others simply checked their weapons one last time. At a distant base, Raina heard the emergency transmissions through her radio headset. She had been excluded from the main operation, assigned to routine patrol duties because her commanders didn't believe she could handle high-intensity combat. But as she listened to the voices of dying Marines, something hardened inside her into absolute determination. She tightened her flight gloves and climbed into her Apache's cockpit. The twin turboshaft engines spun up with their distinctive whine, building to operational power. Over the emergency frequency, her voice was calm and resolute. "Hold your ground. I'm coming." The Marines thought they were hallucinating from exhaustion and blood loss, but then the sound of rotor blades grew louder from the horizon. The entire battlefield looked up to see a single Apache diving through the darkness like an arrow of vengeance. A Marine later recalled, "I was down to my last magazine, waiting for the bullet that would end everything. But when I heard that woman's voice over the radio, my heart suddenly started pounding. I believed we still had hope." What followed challenged every assumption about helicopter combat capabilities. Rena brought her Apache directly into the most dangerous airspace imaginable, directly over a battlefield, where enemy forces had concentrated their anti-aircraft weapons specifically to deny air support to the trapped Marines. But the Apache had been designed for exactly this kind of environment. Its armor could absorb hits that would destroy other aircraft. Its weapon systems were optimized for close air support in contested airspace. Most importantly, Raina had trained extensively for precisely this scenario. While other pilots learned to avoid heavily defended areas, Apache pilots learned to fight through them. She positioned her aircraft to exploit terrain features and enemy blind spots, using tactics that maximized her weapon's effectiveness while minimizing exposure to return fire. Her first attack run devastated an entire enemy armor column with precision-guided Hydra rockets. The explosions lit up the night sky as enemy vehicles erupted in flames. The distinctive sound of the M230 chain gun followed. A deep, rhythmic thump, 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 as 30mm rounds tore through enemy positions with devastating accuracy. Marines who had been pinned down in defensive positions suddenly found themselves with overwhelming fire support. They began advancing, using the cover provided by Raina's continuous attack runs to retake lost ground. Enemy forces, who had been confident of victory against trapped infantry, suddenly faced an aircraft that seemed immune to their anti-aircraft fire and capable of eliminating their heavy weapons with surgical precision. The tide of battle shifted completely within minutes. Radio chatter from the ground reflected the transformation. "She's saving us." How is one helicopter doing this? "We're actually going to make it." The little girl pilot was proving that expertise could overcome any physical disadvantage when lives were at stake. As Raina continued her devastating attack runs, systematically destroying enemy positions with the precision of a master tactician, radio transmissions began revealing her true identity. An intelligence officer monitoring the battle whispered, "That's Silent Hawk." The name sent chills through everyone who heard it. The full story emerged as veteran Marines recognized the tactical brilliance and fearless flying they were witnessing. Raina had once carried the call sign Silent Hawk, the only female Apache pilot to single-handedly destroy an entire enemy air defense network during a classified operation in the Middle East. Her innovative tactics and exceptional flying skills had made her legendary among special operations forces. Military analysts studied her missions as textbook examples of helicopter combat excellence, but during her final operation, her co-pilot and closest friend had been killed when they volunteered for an extremely dangerous mission to extract surrounded special forces. While the mission succeeded and 12 soldiers returned home safely, Reyna blamed herself completely for her co-pilot's death. She had requested transfer to routine duties and allowed people to dismiss her as the little girl pilot, rather than revealing her extraordinary combat record. Tonight, that legendary call sign had returned to save 300 Marines from certain death. The Marine commander, coordinating the defense from his bunker, spoke into his radio with emotion. "She's changing the entire battle by herself." The entire battlefield looked up at the night sky, understanding that the rotor noise wasn't just sound, it was the sound of survival itself. A radar operator later wrote, "I've witnessed hundreds of engagements, but I've never seen a single helicopter change an entire tactical situation." That night, Silent Hawk fought an entire battalion alone. Reyna's Apache moved through the battlefield like a force of nature, appearing and disappearing from enemy positions, always one step ahead of return fire. Each rocket strike eliminated multiple enemy vehicles. Each cannon burst cleared entire sections of defensive positions. Her flying was so precise that she could provide close air support within meters of friendly forces without any risk of friendly fire casualties. Enemy commanders, monitoring the engagement from their command posts, couldn't understand how their carefully planned ambush was being systematically dismantled by a single aircraft. Their anti-aircraft weapons, which should have made the airspace impassable for helicopters, seemed ineffective against a pilot who anticipated their firing patterns and used terrain masking to avoid their coverage zones. "She's not just flying that Apache," observed a military engineer. "She's turning it into a precision instrument of tactical warfare." The Marines on the ground began advancing aggressively, using the cover provided by Reyna's continuous fire support to retake positions they had been forced to abandon hours earlier. What had started as a desperate last stand became a counter-offensive that pushed enemy forces back across the entire front. Senior officers monitoring the battle from distant command centers watched in amazement as tactical displays showed a complete reversal of fortune. "How is this possible?" a general asked his staff. "It's Silent Hawk, sir," came the reply. "She's been here the whole time, letting people call her little girl pilot while possessing skills that most combat pilots will never achieve." The implications were staggering. The military had been wasting one of its most valuable strategic assets, relegating someone of extraordinary capability to routine duties because they judged her by appearance rather than performance. But perhaps most importantly, Reyna's success demonstrated that individual expertise could overcome seemingly impossible odds when applied with precision and determination. A combat analyst reviewing the engagement noted, "She didn't just win a battle. She demonstrated that exceptional skill can transcend any disadvantage, including the preconceptions of others." The enemy forces that had been confident of victory began retreating as their command structure and heavy weapons were systematically eliminated by precise helicopter fire. After 40 minutes of continuous combat, the battlefield was secure. 300 Marines were alive, and the strategic position was held. The little girl pilot had proven that heroism wasn't about size, gender, or meeting conventional expectations. It was about possessing the skills to succeed when everything seemed impossible, and the courage to use those skills when lives depended on it. The question now was whether the military would recognize the value of what they had almost lost, or continue making judgments based on appearances rather than capabilities. After 40 minutes of continuous combat, enemy forces retreated into the desert. 300 Marines had survived what should have been a massacre. Reyna's Apache landed on the shell-scarred airfield, its fuselage blackened by fire, rocket pods completely empty. She opened the cockpit and climbed down, her flight suit covered in dust and smoke from the battle. The soldiers who had mocked her stood in stunned silence. A young Marine spoke quietly. "The little girl saved us all." No one dared look directly into her eyes, but everyone silently acknowledged what had occurred. That night in the mess hall, the chair next to Raina remained empty. No words of praise, no victory celebrations, just heavy silence that spoke louder than any speech. A Marine who had been among the harshest critics approached her table. "Ma'am, I owe you more than an apology. I owe you my life." Raina simply nodded. "You don't owe me anything. I was just doing my job. But we treated you like... You treated me like someone you didn't understand." She interrupted gently. "That's not unusual. Most people judge by appearances." A senior Marine officer who had witnessed the entire engagement joined their conversation. "Ma'am, what you accomplished tonight? Military. Historians will study this battle for decades. I hope they study it as an example of what Marines can accomplish when they don't give up," Raina replied. Over the following days, word of the engagement spread throughout the military. Everyone wanted to understand how a single helicopter pilot had achieved what an entire squadron was supposed to handle. Requests began arriving for Raina to share her tactical knowledge with other pilots. Training commands wanted her to develop new curricula for helicopter combat operations. But more importantly, the incident forced a broader examination of how the military evaluated and utilized its personnel. A review board was established to identify other cases where valuable capabilities might have been overlooked due to superficial judgments. The base commander issued new directives emphasizing performance-based assessments rather than evaluations influenced by physical appearance or personality traits. Raina found herself reluctantly becoming a symbol of the need for the military to look beyond conventional expectations when identifying talent. She wasn't comfortable with the attention, but she understood its importance. Maybe the little girl pilot incident would prevent other skilled personnel from being dismissed because they didn't fit traditional molds. Maybe 300 saved lives would inspire a more thoughtful approach to recognizing capability wherever it appeared. People once laughed and mocked, "Little girl pilot." But that night, she saved 300 Marines from certain death. Raina didn't need apologies or titles, just one flight, and she silenced every laugh forever. The lesson is profound. Never underestimate someone you consider weak. They might be the last wall between life and death. Sometimes the most capable people are dismissed because they don't match conventional expectations. Sometimes heroism comes in packages that challenge our assumptions about strength, competence, and leadership. Physical appearance has nothing to do with courage, skill, or the ability to perform under pressure. The most dangerous mistake is judging capability by superficial characteristics. When lives are at stake, what matters isn't how someone looks or sounds. It's what they can accomplish when everything seems impossible. If you believe that quiet heroes deserve to be remembered, leave a dot in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe to SN Quiet Stories to hear more tales like this.